Hello everyone, I'm Nitahone, and every time a new set is fully spoiled, as Guild of Ravnica will be tomorrow, I strive to provide a limited review for the community that will be complete before the pre-release. I review every card in the set, doing a new color every day, and in this case, 2 separate videos covering all the gold cards because there's so many in this set. This makes for a week jammed full of my thoughts on the limited format. This video aims to briefly explain what the meaning behind the various letter grades I use are in my limited review. If you know what my letter grades mean, you can skip this video. If you want a refresher or you don't know what they mean, this is the video for you. I'm going to use cards from the last limited format, Core Set 2019, as examples for each of the different grades. Let's start with A. Cards that are in A are bombs and incredibly efficient removal, and are the kind of card that you want to be first picking, or are so powerful that they pull you into their color. Playing them completely alters the game in your favor, even if you were behind. There are not a ton of A's in any formats. I'm pretty stingy with them. These are the best cards in the set, and the vast majority of them are mythic or rare, though occasionally uncommons make it to the A- range. Some examples of A's from Core Set 2019 are Demanding Dragon and Resplendent Angel. Both not only have great stats for their cost, but come with additional value that can help you win the game. The Demanding Dragon can do 5 damage right away, or make an opponent give up a creature, and the Angel can start making more Angel tokens if left unchecked. Next, let's look at B's. These cards are obviously not quite as good as A's, but are still very good, and are, in cases where there isn't a huge A-level bomb in the pack, which will usually be the case, still cards I'm happy to take with a first pick. These are very good removal spells and very efficient creatures who don't benefit you quite as much as A's, but playing them usually goes a long way to helping you stabilize or pull ahead of an opponent. They aren't quite as game or draft warping as A's are, but seeing them pick 4 or 5 is a good enough signal that a color is open, and you should probably jump into it. Most B's are uncommon rarity or higher, though occasionally commons can make it into the B range. Some examples of B's from Core Set 2019 are Departed Deckhand, an efficient early game creature who is difficult to block and if left unchecked can end games, but dies to literally everything, keeping it from A status, and Hieromancer's Cage, which is a really efficient removal spell since it can deal with any non-land permanent for only 4 mana. So to put it simply, A's and B's are the cards you are happy to first pick. They're the cards you're most excited about in your deck every time you pick them. Next we have C's. This is what the vast majority of cards in a set are, and they appear at every rarity with regularity. They are solid and playable cards that you neither feel pumped or sad about having in your deck. These are decent creatures and solid but not premium removal spells. There are more of these than any other grade. Generally, my grades for set reviews make a bell curve. These are going to make up the majority of your deck. You'll hear people call them filler sometimes. Examples of commons from Core Set 2019 are Omen Speaker, which has decent stats and could help you scry deeper into your deck, and Boggart Brute, who has nice aggressive stats for 3 mana but nothing else going on. Both of these are cards you always play if you were in those colors, but you aren't pumped about them either. That said, you're usually pretty glad if cards of this quality come back to you. Next, we have D's. These are cards that are playable, but just barely, and are cards that you generally aren't happy to have in your deck. They usually only end up there when something went wrong in your draft, like being unsure about what colors you should be in, and so you don't end up with enough playables to avoid having to play these things. These are cards that you feel bad about having in your deck, but they are passable, and in most cases, when your draft goes right, they get cut. These are frequently vanilla creatures that don't offer anything but mediocre stats, or spells that are too narrow or don't do enough. Examples from Core Set 2019 are Field Creeper, which is just a 2-mana 2/1, and Knight of the Tusk, which is just a huge blocker and not really what you want to be spending 6 mana on. Sure, the Creeper was sometimes a little better if your deck had a lot of artifact payoffs, but most of the time you weren't happy it was in your deck. Finally, we have F's. These are the cards that you should never put in your deck. They are that bad. Just like there aren't many A's in the set, there aren't usually many F's, but they are always around. Interestingly, there are actually a decent number of cards at higher rarities in this category, since they often like printing unique and strange effects on cards of that rarity, and sometimes a card is at higher rarity because of how complex it is or how good it might be in constructed. Neither of those things are necessarily good for limited. For Core Set 2019, examples of F's are Magistrate's Scepter and Omniscience. Both ask for massive mana investments and don't give you back enough in return to compensate. Anyway, those are the examples of the clear-cut grades. In addition to these, there are 2 classes of cards that I give 2 sets of grades to because they're too deck-dependent to give a single grade. The first of these are Sideboard Card. These are cards that ideally you don't want to have in your main board, where they're going to be a D or an F on average, but are better in certain matchups out of your sideboard depending on what your opponent's deck is. A good example of this is Plummet, which you can play main board if you're desperate, but most opponents won't have enough flyers to warrant it being main board. If you play against someone with 5 or more flyers, it does get better. It's like a C+ out of your sideboard, and it's the kind of sideboard card that in an ideal world, you have at least one of in your sideboard after most drafts. The other cards I will present 2 grades for are build-around cards. These are cards that are generally a D or an F in your average limited deck, but if you manage to get enough synergies for them, they become considerably better. An example of this from Core Set 2019 was Aether Shield Artificer. In a deck without enough artifact creatures in it, it is just a 4-mana 3/3 too often, which is something like a D or a D+. If you have 5 or more artifact creatures, though, it moves into the C or C+ range, since its beginning of combat ability triggering is actually pretty powerful. It just wasn't super easy in Core Set 2019 to get the requisite artifact creatures to make it worth playing. Some build-around cards have such an absurd ceiling that they are worth first picking, despite the fact that your deck needs to have a certain makeup for them, and I'll mention that in the set review. But most are best to avoid in the early going of a draft until you know what's open and whether your deck can have the necessary makeup to make something like Aether Shield Artificer worthwhile. That does it for this refresher on how I grade cards in my limited review. I can't wait to start talking about all the cards in Guilds of Ravnica starting later this week. Thanks for watching.